Grandparents and kinship care with Hannah Juneau, Holly Savoie, and James Bailey. Kinship is simply when a relative adopts or fosters a child within their family. It is an important topic to consider because studies show that grandparents can reduce trauma effects in grandchildren. It is also important for a social worker to be aware while working in child welfare that kinship should and be the preferred option when having to rehome a child. Statistics on grandfamilies has changed in recent years because, again, social service workers have been strongly advocating to keep the child in the home or at least within the family instead of rehoming the child into a stranger's home such as foster care, which leads to a lot of actual negative effects more than it does positive. 3 parties are most affected by kinship care, and that's the grandparents, the parents whom can no longer care for their children, and the grandchildren themselves. In 2017, 35% of all children adopted from foster care were adopted by relatives. The other 65% were more likely to grow out of foster care, with no permanent family and no home. These kids are more likely to experience unemployment, incarceration, and homelessness than the 35% who were adopted by relatives. A lot of review has been done on grandparents and kinship, such as parents are required to terminate their parental rights to their children whenever having to get them rehomed, adopted, or fostered by someone else, especially by someone in the family. This causes a lot of stress onto the parents, the grandfamily, and the grandchildren. Kinship varies from state to state, so it gets very difficult if families are split between states, going back and forth, so forth and so on. So usually, these informal agreements are undocumented. Basically, it is just an agreement amongst the grandparents and the parents to say, hey, go ahead and keep my children while I go off and get better and hopefully be able to rehome them one day. Because getting the court involved can be very sticky, especially because there's stigmas involved. Stigmas such as financial disabilities, housing, and transportation difficulties. There's a lot of policy and practice in place, thank God for this. Family First Prevention Services Act of February 2018 was one of the first acts that affected the child welfare system largely involving kinship care. Supporting Grandparents Raising Grandchildren Act of July 2018, the intervention through leniency in regards to standards of living conditions for the child, and the intervention through kinship care practice framework. According to research, kinship care in many cases is the best option for a child who cannot live with their birth parents. This is because it minimizes child trauma after separation. Trauma includes losing their belongings, losing connections, victims of various forms of abuse. And it's addressed through it is addressed through counseling. Potential for continued connection with birth parents. Keeping the birth parents in the child's lives has proven both good and bad reviews and results. But it can aid in transition to grandparent kinship care, and it could also cause or result in a greater continuity of care. Unmet needs, limitations, and barriers. According to research, there is a lack of education about available resources, and this is usually because grandparents are very unable to use modern technology or access or research resources for them. There's potential conflicts between the birth parents and grandparents, causing a lot of negative energy and hostility between the families. And sometimes it's unexpected when the grandparent has to take in the grandchildren, so there's a lot of lack of preparation. Whereas traditional foster care parents have to go through tons and tons and tons of training and counseling and assessment before being able to foster children. Our recommendations of these unmet needs is that we train our grandparents and kins how to adjust to life raising grandchildren. But what about teaching coping skills to the kids being raised by grandparents and kin? We may need more emphasization on counseling to children being raised by grandparents and kin, like offering more respites, wraparound services, counselors who are very educated on kinship that can help our grandfamilies, and so on and so forth. As kinship is very important, and we want the best results for our children, have they go to the undesirably situation of having to be rehomed in the first place. Thank you.